Welcome to my channel, or welcome back. In today's video, I'll be sharing yet another birth story, and this is the end of February, just before everything started to shut down. I want to provide a possible trigger warning for this video. There is the mention of birth trauma. The birther in this story's name is Autumn. She had a hospital birth and was a planned VBAC, which means vaginal birth after cesarean. This is Autumn's story. Autumn said this was her second baby. I went into labor at 39 weeks, 1 day, and she had her at 39 weeks and 2 days. She went into labor on February 23rd, 2020, so February of this year, and had her baby on February 24th. I had a big emotional cry, then I tried to take a nap. I felt 3 sharp pains that woke me up. Not contractions, but something different. I think it's really cool in people's birth stories when they begin to notice that labor is either approaching or has began. So yeah, if you're a birthing person about to give birth, remember that if your contractions wake you up, they become consistent, they're timeable, they get more intense, stronger, longer, you might be in labor. I went to the bathroom, I began shaking uncontrollably, had diarrhea, lost a super tiny piece of mucus plug. I walked out and told my fiance, I think I'm gonna go into labor. I want to take a bath. Water began leaking in the bath. If you've had a baby before, or if you're planning to, some may experience diarrhea. This can be referred to as a clean out, which is where you essentially just clean yourself out before labor. Some might lose their mucus plugs before labor. Some could lose their mucus plug during labor or have something called a bloody show, which is different than the mucus plug. But the mucus plug, if you lose it earlier in your pregnancy, it can grow back. But when you're having contractions and other symptoms that are consistent with labor, losing your mucus plug can be a great indication that, hey, maybe you're in labor. So yeah, I just want to share that. Her water began to leak in the bathtub, so let's get back to the story. She began to feel emotional and anxious. Not only was the world getting scary, but she had a previous cesarean and was going to attempt a VBAC. So remember, this is just before COVID shutdowns and stuff like that, and it's different in each state. So yeah, the world was definitely getting scary. I've sympathized with every birther that just became pregnant during this time, was giving birth during this time. Hard on a new parent to deal with the postpartum period, which postpartum period does not always mean depression. I just mean getting used to being a postpartum parent, whether you have 1 child or 2 or 3, and then COVID on top of that. That's a very scary situation. So that's totally valid. I mean, any feelings around anyone's birth is totally valid. She also had a cesarean previous to this and was anxious about her VBAC. I was so nervous, I was mentally numb while in labor. While her baby was being born, she says that she felt lonely. So I'm not sure if her partner was allowed to be with her during this time. Regardless, you are in fact the only one in the room going through the motions, it can feel lonely. My body felt jittery. They wouldn't let me up much. My contractions were very low, incredibly sharp, every 2 minutes on the dot from the start. My chest hurt extremely bad because I'd had some type of illness for a few weeks and could barely breathe. I just feel like no one cares about the birther in some situations, especially like this where they say she wasn't allowed to move. That's very upsetting. I totally understand what this birther was going through, because with my own birth experience, my birth trauma, I was told that I couldn't move. I was told that it would be difficult to help me pee, to hold my pee, that I could not go to the bathroom because of my monitors and my IV, but really it wasn't that hard to help me to the bathroom. It wasn't that hard to put the monitors back on. Around 14 to 16 hours in, I knew that's where I'd end up. I was having natural labor with ruptured waters, contractions every 2 minutes, barely half a centimeter. My OB suggested an epidural at that point. I agreed, and the epidural let me sleep. So I slept and used a peanut ball. Everyone raves about dilating so fast with them. And still, after about 24 hours total, I was stuck at 2 centimeters and -2 station. I called my OB to my room and sobbed that I was done. Mentally exhausted. The nurses wouldn't let me walk when I was able to. Peanut ball was doing nothing. I wanted to get home with my son and didn't want to keep adding my days to my stay, just to be told I need a repeat. After her cesarean, she said I just cried. They took her and cleaned her up. I was shaking so badly I could barely touch her because it felt like I'd rip her arm off. She had a repeat cesarean and she feels devastated. Wish I'd done so many things differently. I'm 4 months postpartum and I cry a lot. Mentally, I felt great the first 2 days. Then I became incredibly depressed. I still am. I feel like a failure, like less than as a mother, like a fraud. There's a disconnect where I know I'm raising kids, but I don't feel truthful to say I gave birth to them. I'm bitter and jealous and really having a hard time, still at 4 months postpartum. Autumn is only 4 months postpartum. She just had a baby. Those are some very honest and insightful words that she shared with me and shared with all of us. So what is birth trauma? I'm gonna read from the VBAC Link because they have a section on trauma. VBAC Link is specifically for vaginal birth after cesarean. Birth is unpredictable, it is unknown and unexpected. Vaginal birth isn't always perfect and beautiful, and cesareans aren't always traumatic and heartbreaking. If you've had a cesarean and you're here and you're like, my cesarean was okay, it's because every birth experience is totally different. Some may even find it empowering and positive. We all experience things differently, and birth isn't just one size fits all. But what does birth trauma actually mean? How do you know if you have trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, or just plain old baby blues? Birth trauma and postpartum depression share some sort of the same symptoms, but because they are completely different from each other, they need to be treated differently as well. It is also common to have birth trauma and postpartum depression, so treating both with medical support might be part of the healing process. Birth trauma is a simple way to say PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. It may also apply to parents who have some, but not all, of the symptoms required to diagnose PTSD. It is common for people to confuse the term PTSD as something only military service members can get from war-related experiences because the identification of the disorder first appeared in soldiers after the Vietnam War. However, PTSD can happen to anyone after any traumatic event, and that includes like assault, or a life-changing event occurred. It is important to note that trauma lies with the person who experienced it or witnessed it. It's not necessary for anyone else to perceive the event as traumatic at all. That means that no one has to agree that your experience was traumatic or not. No outsider from what you have personally experienced has to say, yeah, that sounds terrible, or that doesn't sound so bad. You don't need an outsider's opinion on how you perceived your own experience and what you went through personally, because they don't know. Let us not forget the partners or other support people who are in the room during a traumatic event. They too can be affected by PTSD and need to be acknowledged, as we often focus primarily on the person who gave birth. So that means the partner or support person who was at the traumatic birth could also be affected by PTSD. It could even be nurses, midwives, doctors, whoever else is present could also take home some trauma. Birth trauma can affect a birthing parent with loneliness, or that's due to lack of support or lack of understanding. Guilt. No one talks about their traumatic birth stories, and even between parents who share similar birth-related trauma, each person handles it differently. It can be even more depressing if they feel guilty or responsible somehow. That is a terrible burden to bear and something that even healthcare professionals don't address. Avoiding future pregnancy. So avoidance is common with my own PTSD. This can unfortunately cause a parent to not want additional kids or children due to how their birth went. And of course, reproductive health and everything is always the birther or parent's decision. That's no one else's decision to make. It can cause strained relationships, avoidance of triggers, difficulty bonding with a new baby. And for some parents, their biggest concern is everyday challenges they experience trying to bond with their new baby, who they see as a consistent reminder of their traumatic experience. And that's valid. That doesn't mean that you're a bad parent. Not at all. I don't want to spend too much time what causes birth trauma, but the perception of care, which means how the birthing person perceived that they were treated. If they feel unheard, misunderstood, or that their wishes weren't respected, it can lead to form negative feelings about their experience. Feeling that you have a say in your birth as it is happening is a critical part of avoiding trauma. Obstetric violence or abuse from providers. Unfortunately, obstetric violence isn't that uncommon, and it's dismissed or accepted in medicalized birth settings. So it's basically normalized in regular medical birth settings. Sudden changes in plans or expectations. When things quickly take a turn towards something unplanned and not wanted, like a cesarean, it can force a parent to react in a hyper-stimulated way. There may not be enough time to go over possibilities or discuss options when there is a true emergency, and staff just needs to react swiftly to save a life. Pain medication not working. They felt like the whole cesarean or were dismissed in their distress and knocked out during general anesthesia. This is a prime scenario for birth trauma. Medical interventions. When interventions are necessary, these unplanned and unprepared for scenarios can be difficult to process. Duration of labor. Long, tedious labors can take a huge emotional toll on a mother. Lack of sleep, nutrition, and mental clarity can have a big impact on how a parent reflects back on their birth. Prolonged labors can cause fears and stresses to be amplified as time progresses. These fears and stresses include need for undesired interventions, being put on a time clock for labor to progress, feeling like you are a pot of water being watched and not performing as expected, failure to meet expectations of yourself or how your birth will go, feeling like an overall failure and not being able to do it right. And then there's stillbirth, little to no communication between staff, parent, and partner. Fear is the enemy. It's an exaggeration of the unknown and forces us to live through negative emotions before they have the possibility of happening. These experiences are all valid. Good outcomes, bad outcomes, outcomes where you just don't know if it was good or bad. Those are some really difficult emotions to navigate, especially alone, especially during COVID and this isolation. I feel like it sucks to call women strong, but not only women, but parents. We don't ask to be strong. We don't ask for these things, like to give birth and to go through all of these things. Maybe we don't want to be strong, but we just are. And it sucks. It's not failing to need help though when you're giving birth. And I totally understand evaluating your whole birth and being like, I could have done this, this, and this, and maybe these things wouldn't have happened. So it may not feel true to some birthers when I say, look, you did give birth. No matter what kind of birth you have, you gave birth. That may not feel true to some people. So how can you heal from a difficult birth experience? The VBAC Link has a whole list of talking to your OB, midwife, therapist, counselor specializing in trauma or PTSD, trusted family and friends, talking with other parents who have suffered from birth trauma. So knowledge of birth-related PTSD varies tremendously. If you do not feel like you're being heard by the person you're talking to, reach out to someone else. The VBAC Link has a community on Facebook to help find local support in your area. But I also want to read from my friend's website, which is a trauma-informed doula website. They offer reproductive health support up to abortion as well, so it includes everything, full spectrum. But I want to read from their site because they actually have a form that you can fill out to help you process your traumatic birth or just your birth in general. So here is the birth story reflection form. It's reflect and tell your story. Follow these prompts to tell your birth story. Can help you create a narrative of self-compassion and personal growth after your traumatic or disappointing birth experience. These journal prompts are here for you to use to self-heal after you give birth. They are meant to be used in order and entirely, but of course you should use them however feels most right to you. These questions are designed to build upon one another, moving through a shared process of making meaning from our lived experiences. This is not designed for a full, fluffy storytelling experience. This is not designed to instill feelings of shame, regret, hopelessness, or a narrow sense of positivity for the future. This is not designed to help you find a silver lining. This is trauma-informed reflective practice may resurface upsetting, distressing memories, feelings, and reminders of difficult choices. Keeping this journal or diary private or moving through this process in a quiet and private space may help you be more open and honest about your feelings. I want to stop right there and just say that journaling and doing balance statements and just writing out my feelings in general helps me with all sorts of different traumatic experiences, including my birth. So this is really why I wanted to read this to you all. It's helpful to me. Maybe it can be helpful to others. What helps me may not help others. Of course, we all should reach out to support if that is accessible to us, or just to anyone that we might trust. When we're beating ourselves up about how we feel about our birth, I think when processing a birth, it's best to look at what did happen and what you can do about it. So looking at what happened, what can you change? Really can't change anything. But looking back, what can you begin to accept? You can start using balance statements. Affirmations sometimes, especially when processing things like birth trauma, just do not feel true. Like if I were to just go straight in and say, like, I'm not a failure, I did give birth, that probably wouldn't feel true. Something that I would say to myself that would feel more true would be a balance statement. So I feel like a failure, I feel like I didn't give birth, and that's the negative cognition. So what's positive? What's on the opposite end of that? I gave birth, I'm not a failure. But what's in the middle? What's in the middle feels the most true. It's balance. Maybe you could just say, I did my best in that situation. Or you could change it to what feels best to you. Personally, you don't have to use that. If I was supporting someone who had these feelings, I would just be like, yeah, like I hear you. I'm sorry that happened. It sounds like you had a difficult time. You don't want to hear your friend talk negatively about themselves. Sometimes things are just not all puppy dogs and rainbows. If they feel a certain way, hear them. Let them speak. You don't really have to have some big response. Just listen. I think a person feeling heard with these feelings is more important than you challenging how they feel and trying to get them to feel the opposite way, the positive way. Like, you did give birth, you did do this. I understand that me saying, oh, you gave birth, it doesn't have to be vaginal. It may not feel good and it may not feel true. Remember, this is a traumatic birth, and we don't ever want to reevaluate someone's traumatic birth and try to say what they should do or could have done, because they already feel maybe some guilt, maybe some sadness, maybe some grieving. They may feel a lot of different emotions. So if you're supporting someone and they come to you, don't say, well, why didn't you do this? Why couldn't you have done this? Or at least. Please don't at least people, because all of these things minimize and discredit everything that they're telling you. And I understand the sentiment and the want for your friend to be happy, or your partner or whoever to be happy, and you don't want people that you love or care about to have had a bad experience in any way. You want them to be happy. But in order to get to a good place up here, we really have to listen to those who are speaking. Autumn, again, I just want to thank you for sharing this birth story with so many people. I'm so sorry that you had the experience that you did, and I understand how hard it is to be kind to yourself in these situations. Thanks for watching my video. Subscribe if you'd like, and I'll see you next time.